Chapter 17, A Tantrum. She had got up very early in the morning, and she had worked hard in the garden, and she was tired and sleepy. So as soon as Martha had brought her supper and she'd eaten it, she was glad to go to bed. As she laid her head on her pillow, she murmured to herself, "I'll go out before breakfast and work with Deacon, and then afterward, I believe I'll go and see him." She thought it was the middle of the night when she was awakened by such dreadful sounds that she jumped out of bed in an instant. "What is it? What is it?" The next minute she felt quite sure that she knew. Doors were opened and shut, and there were hurrying feet in the corridors, and someone was crying and screaming at the same time, screaming and crying in a most horrible way. "It's Colin," she said. "He's having one of those tantrums the nurse called hysterics. How awful it sounds." As she listened to the sobbing screams, she did not wonder that people were so frightened that they gave him his own way in everything rather than to hear that. She put her hands over her ears, and she felt sick and shivering. "I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do," she kept saying. "I can't bear it." Once she wondered if he would stop if she dared go to him, and then she remembered how he had driven her out of the room, and she thought that perhaps the sight of her might make it worse. Even when she pressed her hands more tightly over her ears, she could not keep the awful sounds out. She hated them so, and was so terrified by them, that suddenly they began to make her feel angry. And she felt as if she would like to fly into a tantrum herself and frighten him the way he was frightening her. She was not used to anyone's temper but her own. She took her hands from around her ears, and she sprang up and she stamped her foot. "He ought to be stopped. Somebody ought to make him stop. Somebody ought to beat him," she said. Just then she heard feet almost running down the corridor, and her door opened and the nurse came in. She was not laughing now by any means. She looked rather pale. "Oh, he's worked himself into hysterics," she said in a great hurry. "He'll do himself harm. No one can do anything with him. You come and try like a good child. He likes you." "He turned me out of the room this morning," said Mary, stamping her foot with excitement. The stamp rather pleased the nurse. The truth was, she had been afraid that she might find Mary crying and hiding under the bedclothes. "That's right," she said. "You're in the right humor. You go and scold him. Give him something new to think of. Do go, child, as quick as ever you can." It was not until afterward that Mary realized that the thing had been, funny as well as dreadful. It was funny that all the grown-up people were so frightened that they came to a little girl just because they guessed she was almost as bad as Colin was himself. She flew along the corridor, and the nearer she got to the screams, the higher her temper mounted. She felt quite wicked by the time she reached the door. She slapped it open with her hand, and she ran across the room to the four-poster bed. "You stop!" she shouted. "You stop! I hate you. Everybody hates you. I wish everybody would run out of the house and let you scream yourself to death. You will scream yourself to death in a minute, and I wish you would." A nice, sympathetic child could neither have thought nor said such things. But it just happened that the shock of hearing them was the best possible thing for this hysterical boy, whom no one had ever dared to restrain or contradict. He'd been lying on his face, beating his pillow with his hands, and he actually almost jumped around. He turned so quickly at the sound of the furious little voice. His face looked dreadful, white and red and swollen, and he was gasping and choking, but savage little Mary did not care one atom. "If you scream another scream," she said, "I'll scream too, and I can scream louder than you, and I'll frighten you. I'll frighten you." He had actually stopped screaming because she had startled him so. The scream, which had been almost coming, had choked him, and the tears were streaming down his face, and he shook all over. "Oh, I can't stop," he cried and sobbed. "I can't, I can't." "You can," shouted Mary. "Half what ails you is hysterics and temper. Just hysterics, hysterics, hysterics." And she stamped her foot each time she said it. "I felt the lump. I felt it," choked out Colin. "I knew I should. I shall have a hunch on my back, and then I shall die." And he began to writhe again and turned on his face and sobbed and wailed, but he didn't scream. "You didn't feel any lump," contradicted Mary fiercely. "If you did, it was only a hysterical lump. Hysterics makes lumps. There's nothing the matter with your horrid back. Nothing but hysterics. Turn over and let me look at your back." She liked the word hysterics and felt somehow as if it had an effect on him. He was probably like herself and had never heard it before. "Nurse," she commanded, "come here and show me his back this instant." The nurse, Miss Medlock, and Martha had been standing huddled together near the door, staring at her, their mouths half open. All three had gasped with fright more than once. The nurse came forward as if she were half afraid. Colin was heaving with great breathless sobs. Perhaps he won't let me," she hesitated in a low voice. Colin heard her, however, and he gasped out between two sobs, "Show her! She'll see then." It was a poor, thin back to look at when it was bared. Every rib could be counted, and every joint of the spine, though Mistress Mary did not count them as she bent over and examined them with a solemn, savage little face. She looked so sour and old-fashioned that the nurse turned her head aside to hide the twitching of her mouth. There was just a minute silent, for even Colin tried to hold his breath while Mary looked up and down his spine, up and down, as intently as if she had been the great doctor from London.